Hello, I'm John McConnell. I'm editor-in-chief of the Lancet Infectious Diseases, a journal which is celebrating 20 years of publication this year. And during the past 18 months, I have been looking at a huge number of submissions to my journal and other Lancet journals on COVID-19. So in relation to this, one of the first questions I've been asked to address is how is the credibility of medical information established? And I don't think the process, the fundamentals of the process which we have used for establishing credibility have been different in the pandemic from any other time. So credibility, of course, requires replication. It requires large samples. It requires repeated work, and it requires establishing a consensus amongst experts so that hypotheses are testable and found to be reliable. That's certainly what we've done during this pandemic. And as we've moved through the pandemic, then the sort of information we've been looking at has changed. So to begin with, it was all about establishing that there was a new disease, what caused it, and what the characteristics of the disease were. And then we moved on to what I would call the management phase, where people started to project how the pandemic was going to go through various models and what could be done to change the course of the pandemic. And also, we had to start looking at treatments. So drug interventions, but they can also be non-pharmaceutical interventions as well to prevent disease spread. And then we moved into the phase we're in now, the preventive phase. So that's how we can bring down the scale of the pandemic and turn the pandemic into an endemic disease using vaccination. And the process for establishing credibility of medical information has been pretty constant throughout the various phases. However, it has been a very busy and very challenging time. And at times we've had to move more quickly than we would outside of a public health crisis.
Right. You are explaining credibility and the way that things are validated. You need to move faster. What do you mean by faster? Do you mean, is it one step like the peer review process, which has to be accelerated, or is there other steps in the process of reviewing which has been challenging with the pandemic?
So it was important to establish that COVID-19 is an airborne disease. It transmits from person to person. And people are interested in things like the R number. So that's how many new cases could a single infected person spread infection to. They were interested in things like what percentage of people might require hospitalization, what proportion might require ventilation and critical care beds. And that's the sort of information which we had to attempt to roll out extremely quickly indeed. And so to begin with, I think some of that information was perhaps not as reliable as we would normally want outside of a pandemic situation. So it didn't have the replication which we would normally expect outside a pandemic situation. But it was very important to get that information out so that people on the front line could start taking respiratory preventive measures, for example, start wearing PPE, could start planning for the likely load on hospital resources. And we had to call on our peer reviewers to act very quickly, to be turning around the requests for peer review in just a couple of days. Now, what was difficult for many of the people that we were inviting to be peer reviewers is that they were the very same people who were managing COVID on the front line. So it became a period of intense pressure for the peer reviewers and for us as editors. But as I've said already, the basic processes remained the same. And I think as information has accumulated, there were some errors early on in the information that was being circulated. They have been ironed out and corrected.
So you mean that the main challenge was the peer contacts were as well at the front line and very busy, and at the same time, the overload of information to be reviewed.
Before the pandemic, the Lancet Infectious Diseases was receiving about 40 to 50 papers of all varieties every week. And at the peak of submissions, which was in April of last year, we received about 370 submissions in 1 week, a greater than sevenfold increase in submissions. So our first task as editors was to sift through that weight of papers and decide what was actually worth peer reviewing. Now, quite a lot of what we were receiving were comments and letters. Quite a lot of that was the sort of what I call our experience, a very short case series. And that's the sort of information which we had to regrettably put to one side in order to try and look at the weightier information which could guide policy.
So how are you sorting out the key information? Is it directly in your teams at the Lancet, or do you have groups of reviewers dedicated to the prioritizations?
We did it all within our Lancet teams. Everybody worked much harder, some extremely long days. There were several journals within the Lancet family which received a surge in submissions. The Lancet Weekly itself, Lancet Infectious Diseases, Lancet Respiratory Medicine, Lancet Public Health, Global Health, all received a big surge in submissions. But that wasn't quite the same for some of the other journals. So what we did is we tapped into the expertise of the editors in those journals which weren't quite as busy, and we redirected them towards looking at papers for the busier journals in order that we could sift through that information as quickly as possible.
So how did you manage to disseminate the information and the actionable clinical insights needed for the frontline?
Everything that we published related to COVID-19 went online first before it subsequently appeared in the issue. We didn't publish many more full research articles than we would in a normal year. I think we went up by about a third in the number of research articles we published. We did publish a lot more letters to the editor because they are a short and rapid way of getting out important information. And we published more comments as well. Overall, we published much more material, but it was primarily directed towards the letters and the comments side of things.
Did you see on the online visits or the way it was disseminated online a peak of usage on the content online?
Oh, everything from across all the Lancet journals went into our COVID-19 hub, which anyone can come and read for free. And I think the number of article views for the Lancet Infectious Diseases between 2019 and 2020 went up something like tenfold. So it was an incredible increase in usage.
Did you get feedbacks from the health professionals on the content itself?
Well, we got feedback by the traditional route, which is by sending correspondence. There's a lot of health professionals on social media these days, particularly on Twitter, and we got some very useful feedback there. And also, of course, on Twitter, there's an awful lot of people who are how can I put this kindly, are new to the field, what have rather disparagingly been called armchair epidemiologists. And we gotten a lot of criticism, but also some constructive feedback from social media. And some of that has been quite difficult to manage. I think actually emotionally at times quite difficult to manage, but because some of it has been rather cynically misinterpreted. The honesty and the motives of the editors of the journals have been really very deeply unfairly maligned at times. And I think that's been the hardest part of dealing with the incredible surge of interest in information published by the Lancet.
Between preprints available online and then finally get published, what are the estimates?
Electronic preprints have been around for a quarter of a century or so. And I certainly historically have been rather in favor of the idea in general. I think as a matter of principle, there's not much difference between a abstract that you submit for presentation at a conference and electronic preprint. And of course, a preprint allows information to be presented in much more depth. Now, the potential downside is the opportunity for people who have an agenda to disseminate information which is not credible, and that has to be dealt with. And I think overall, where that incredible information has come out as preprints, it has very quickly attracted criticism from experts, and there has been modification or even on occasion retraction of preprints. So that sort of unofficial ad hoc peer review process related to preprints, I think in general has worked. When I last looked, there had been well over 50,000 preprints related to COVID-19 posted online since January of last year. And they're still being posted at a rate of about 600 per week, which is an incredible amount of information to keep up with. I think a real concern is that of those 600 or so, I doubt that very many actually attract comments, which leads to their improvement and modification. But certainly before the pandemic, the consensus of opinion was that majority of preprints did turn into journal articles within 2 to 3 years at most of first appearing as preprints. And even now, in the time of COVID, preprints are only making up 20% of all the papers that have been published on COVID.
Okay, so did you see some changes in the way?
Yes, we have peer reviewed and published 1 or 2 papers that have been originally published as preprints, and the criticism which they attracted as preprints, was some of which was very helpful and constructive, has led to their improvement in collaboration with the formal peer review process. We've also seen 1 or 2 papers which have attracted criticism, and those papers have been withdrawn. I mean, one in particular, which is a matter of public record, came from some authors in Barcelona earlier this year, claiming that vitamin D supplementation was an effective treatment for hospitalized patients with COVID-19. It very rapidly became apparent that the authors of that paper had characterized the type of research which they were doing. And that paper had been formally submitted to the Lancet Infectious Diseases, but because of those informal comments and the comments of our formal peer reviewers, that paper was withdrawn. The way that the authors had reported their research was actually formally investigated by the Spanish academic authorities. And that is a matter of record, which is posted on the preprint server.
Have you seen or received feedbacks on the way that the healthcare professionals are consuming medical information? Did they change their habits?
Yeah, 1 or 2 very high-profile reports which have come out of preprints, which have led to changes in practice. So I'm thinking, for example, of one of the big randomized treatment trials done in the UK was called Discovery. And the Discovery trial showed, for example, that dexamethasone is a fairly effective treatment for COVID-19 in patients who require respiratory support. And that led to a change in practice recommendations, even before the paper had been formally submitted to a journal and published. I suppose when you're deciding whether to change practice or not based on a preprint alone, you are putting quite a lot of trust into the academic record of the researchers who've done the studies, and also on the size of the studies themselves. If I were a frontline healthcare worker, I would be very suspicious about changing practice based on case series of 20 or 30 patients. That Discovery information on dexamethasone led to it being incorporated into treatment guidelines. Similarly, Discovery also produced results related to hydroxychloroquine, which showed it didn't work, as did the huge multinational solidarity trial, which came out as which first appeared as a preprint as a result of that information that hydroxychloroquine was removed from most treatment guidelines. So yes, there have very definitely been examples of information which has been disseminated before the formal journal process, leading to changes in practice.
Very insightful. For the situation where we are now, let's say end of the third wave, do you feel a change now? Are things moving differently now?
I think the key thing that has changed for me is the attention which the general public are now devoting to scientific information in a way which very seldom happened before the pandemic. And I think even probably our parents and grandparents know what our number is now. That was unimaginable before the pandemic. Everybody knows the names of the vaccine candidates which are being used. And again, I doubt most people could have named a single vaccine before the pandemic. So there is a huge interest in biological sciences. In a way that there wasn't before. And there's also, it has become intensely political in a way which was seldom the case before. I will be intrigued to see how long that lasts, whether the broader knowledge of science will continue to be the case, and whether it will lead to not just among scientists, but amongst the general public and amongst politicians in more rational and better informed decision making in the future. There are very good treatment and management guidelines for COVID-19 now. And they have been developed through the collection, publication, through research and publication. Those guidelines come from extremely trustworthy bodies. They are based around the credibility of medical information, which, as I said at the very beginning, comes from repetition, comes from consensus, comes from weight of information from extremely large studies. I know that there is more vaccine hesitancy in France than there is in the UK. So, for example, in the UK, the estimate is that something like 95% of adults over the age of 65 have had at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine, and I think it's 90% for those over the age of 50. So the vaccine uptake has been incredibly high, and has outstripped expectations, actually. So the best way of countering the hesitancy around vaccination is to disseminate information around what the effectiveness is in real life, compared with the frequency of adverse events. And still, in almost every circumstance, the risks of COVID-19 vastly outweigh the risks of vaccination. Obviously, I think people should be free to make their own decisions about vaccination. I think there's a lot of sense around directing the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines towards younger people because of this risk of blood clotting. But remember again that the risk of blood clotting is something like 30-fold greater from COVID-19 itself than it is from vaccination. So people in taking personal decisions and individuals weighing up the credibility of data, they mustn't just consider what the intervention is, they must consider the diseases they are preventing.